My name is Emilia Palmer. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my life, I've been described with words that sound kind but feel small. Steady, sensible, supportive, the quiet one. I live just outside Boston now, in a house that is finally in my name alone. I work in corporate governance, compliance, contracts, oversight. The kind of work most people don't notice unless something goes wrong. I've always been comfortable in that space, behind the scenes, watching patterns, listening longer than I speak. If you had asked my family to describe me 10 years ago, they would have said I was dependable, loyal, maybe too soft for the business world. They would have said my older brother, Daniel, was the bold one, the visionary, the risk-taker, the natural leader. They weren't wrong about him being bold, but boldness and integrity are not the same thing. This story isn't about a dramatic showdown. There were no screaming matches in boardrooms, no glasses thrown against walls, no triumphant speeches. What happened unfolded slowly, quietly, over the years. It began when my brother maneuvered me out of the company our father built, using debt, leverage, and my own trust against me. I lost more than my position. I lost financial stability. I lost my reputation in our industry. I lost the illusion that blood automatically meant protection. And then years later, I stood in silence while Daniel faced something eerily familiar. Financial collapse, mounting debt, investors withdrawing, the weight of decisions he once assured everyone were visionary. People have asked me since, gently but persistently, why didn't you step in? Why didn't you save him? The truth is, I could have helped. I understood the structure of the contracts better than anyone. I saw the vulnerabilities before the banks did. I had the expertise. I had the means. But I did nothing. Not out of rage, not out of revenge, and certainly not out of cruelty. I did nothing because years earlier, when I was the one drowning, he had watched me sink and called it strategy. This story is about invisibility turning into leverage, about silence transforming from weakness into choice, about learning that stepping back can sometimes be the most decisive action of all. I won't dramatize what happened. I won't villainize my brother. He isn't a monster. He's a man who believed winning justified the method. And I'm a woman who learned that survival sometimes requires stillness. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been quietly replaced, if you've ever watched someone take credit for what you built, you might understand the weight of standing still when the scales finally balance. Tell me, have you ever stayed silent not because you were powerless, but because you finally understood your power? Before everything fractured, I was the reliable one. In every family photo, I'm standing slightly behind Daniel. Not hidden, just positioned. He had the arm around our father's shoulders. I had the folder, the documents, the responsibility no one wanted to think about. Our father built Palmer Industrial Supply from a single warehouse in 1989. By the time Daniel and I stepped into leadership roles, it was a regional manufacturing supplier with long-term contracts, union relationships, and a reputation for stability. Stability was our brand. Daniel handled the expansion, vision decks, investor lunches. He had the voice for it, confident, persuasive, forward-moving. I handled the contracts, the risk assessments, the compliance audits that prevented lawsuits no one ever knew were coming. I rewrote clauses that vendors tried to slip past us. I flagged debt covenants that could trigger acceleration. I reviewed line by line what Daniel skimmed and called fine. In meetings, people addressed him first. Daniel, what's the growth projection? Daniel, what's the 5-year plan? When they needed numbers explained, they turned to me. Emilia, can you clarify page 12? I wasn't resentful. Not then. I believed roles were roles. Someone had to be the steady foundation. I told myself that being trusted with the details meant I was indispensable. But indispensable is not the same as visible. At family gatherings, the narrative was even simpler. Daniel was ambitious. Daniel was fearless. Daniel would take the company national. I was described as careful, thoughtful, a good balance to my brother's boldness. Balance is a polite word for containment. There were subtle jokes I pretended not to notice. If it were up to Emilia, we'd still be operating out of one warehouse. Daniel would laugh at dinners. She'd have us triple-checking everything before we moved. Everyone would chuckle warmly, even me, because on the surface, it sounded affectionate. But underneath it was a quiet framing. I was the brake pedal. He was the engine. When our father officially retired, ownership transferred equally to both of us. 50-50. On paper, we were partners. In reality, Daniel began positioning himself as the face of the company. Media interviews featured him alone. Industry panels invited him. Investors called him directly. I told myself it didn't matter. I didn't enjoy spotlight attention anyway. I preferred the clean certainty of a well-drafted contract to applause. What I didn't see, what I refused to see, was how narratives harden into truth. The more people saw him as the visionary, the more they assumed I was secondary. The more they assumed I was secondary, the more they filtered information through him first. It was subtle. A missed CC on an email. A strategy meeting was scheduled while I was told it was just preliminary. A banker was asking Daniel about terms I had drafted. No one insulted me outright. No one dismissed me to my face. Instead, I was gently repositioned. Supportive, complimentary, important but not central. And I accepted it. Because I believed competence would protect me. I believed documentation would protect me. I believed that equity, legal, signed, notarized equity meant security. I thought being indispensable meant I couldn't be removed. I was wrong. Looking back now, I understand something I didn't then. The way people describe you often determines what they believe you're capable of. They believed Daniel was capable of bold action. They believed I was capable of endurance. Neither of those assumptions was entirely wrong, but only one of them would eventually reshape everything. At that time, though, I was still the quiet partner. The one who stayed late. The one who made sure payroll never bounced. The one who fixed problems before they became visible. The one everyone assumed would always remain. And tell me, have you ever mistaken being needed for being secure? The first cut wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a raised voice or a slammed door. It came wrapped in opportunity. Daniel called me into his office one afternoon, about 18 months after our father retired. He was energized, pacing slightly, sleeves rolled up, eyes bright with something that looked like progress. "I've been talking to a private equity group," he said. "Minority stake, growth capital. We can expand into 3 new states within 2 years. Private equity, leverage, outside control." My body registered the tension before my mind formed the objection. "On what terms?" I asked. He handed me a draft summary. I scanned quickly. Convertible preferred shares, aggressive revenue milestones, personal guarantees tied to performance triggers. "And debt layering," I added quietly. He waved a hand. "It's structured debt. It's normal." Normal is a flexible word. I spent the next week reviewing the full term sheet. There were clauses that would dilute our voting power under certain conditions. There were covenants that, if breached, would allow the investors to demand restructuring authority. I walked into Daniel's office with annotated pages. "This gives them effective control if projections miss by more than 8%, I said calmly. "And the projections are optimistic." He leaned back, smiling, not dismissive, but "Emilia, you always assume worst-case scenarios." "I assume probable scenarios," I corrected gently. He sighed, not angrily, just impatiently. "This is how companies scale. You can't protect every downside forever." It was the first time I felt it. The subtle framing of caution as limitation. We debated for hours, not heated, just firm. I wasn't against expansion. I was against structural vulnerability disguised as opportunity. At the end of the week, Daniel scheduled a meeting with the investors. I wasn't invited. I found out because our CFO mentioned it casually in the hallway. "Oh, you're not coming to New York tomorrow?" he asked. "Tomorrow?" I replied. Daniel said it was just preliminary discussions. Preliminary. Without the partner who co-owned half the company. When I confronted Daniel later that evening, he was composed. "It's just relationship building," he said. "They want to connect with the person driving growth." "Driving growth. And I'm not?" I asked evenly. "You know what I mean," he replied quickly. "You're essential, but they're buying into an expansion strategy." There it was. Essential, but not central. The meeting went forward without me. When Daniel returned, he presented it as progress. "They're excited," he said as he said. "They love our trajectory." He had verbally agreed to revised projections, higher than what we had ever realistically sustained. "You adjusted the numbers?" I asked. Within range of optimism. It was small. That's the important part. He didn't remove me. He didn't change ownership. He didn't insult me publicly. He simply made a strategic decision without the partner, who legally required inclusion. And everyone treated it as normal. Our CFO deferred to him. The investors referenced him as the primary contact. Even our legal counsel directed follow-up questions to Daniel first. I told myself it was temporary, a tactical oversight. I rationalized that my role was still secure because the documents still required my signature. But something shifted that week. For the first time, I saw how easily influence moves before authority does. And I felt something I hadn't allowed before. Not anger, alertness. Because the first small cut isn't meant to wound. It's meant to test whether you'll bleed quietly. Tell me, when someone sidelines you just this once, do you call it strategy or do you remember it? After the New York meeting, nothing exploded. That was the problem. If Daniel had openly overruled me, I would have had something concrete to push against. If he had insulted my judgment in front of the board, I could have defended it. Instead, the pattern softened around me like fog. The private equity negotiations accelerated. Calls were scheduled during times I was told were tentative. Draft revisions were circulated with tight turnaround windows. I was still included, technically, but always a step behind the momentum. When I raised concerns about revenue projections tied to debt covenants, Daniel would nod thoughtfully. "We'll manage it," he'd say. "We'll manage it." The phrase sounded collaborative, but decisions were already being framed before I entered the room. There was one board meeting I remember vividly. An outside advisor presented a slide deck showing expansion forecasts that relied on cost reductions I had never approved. I leaned forward. "Can you clarify which operational efficiencies these are based on?" The advisor glanced at Daniel. He answered instead, "We're sure streamlining some redundancies." Redundancies. It took me a moment to realize he meant compliance overhead. My department, my team. I didn't react emotionally. I asked for numbers, specifics, modeling assumptions. After the meeting, Daniel closed the conference room door. "You don't have to interrogate every presenter," he said calmly. "It makes us look divided." "We are divided," I replied quietly. "On risk tolerance." He smiled in that patient way people do when they believe they're being reasonable. "You focus on protecting what we have. I focus on building what we could become. That's always been the balance." Balance again. I began rationalizing. He's under pressure. Investors expect confidence. Public disagreement undermines leverage. I told myself staying composed was strategic, that voicing objections privately was more mature. But privately, my objections were reframed as anxiety. "You worry too much," he told me once, not unkindly. "You assume collapse before growth." The irony of that sentence would take years to fully reveal itself. What changed most wasn't his behavior, it was mine. I stopped pushing as hard in meetings, not because I agreed, but because I noticed the subtle shift in body language when I spoke. The slight tension, the quick glances toward Daniel to gauge his reaction. When he dismissed a concern lightly, others followed. And I began questioning myself. Was I too conservative? Was I clinging to outdated caution? Was I becoming the obstacle? Disrespect rarely arrives as cruelty. It arrives as a reinterpretation. I wasn't being erased. I was being repositioned. From partner to support. From strategist to safeguard. From co-owner to operational backbone. The company closed the private equity deal 6 months later. Structured debt is layered into our balance sheet. Aggressive growth targets locked into legal commitments. I signed. That's the part people ask about later. Why did you sign? Because at that point, refusal would have triggered internal conflict that investors could interpret as instability. Because half the board had already aligned behind Daniel's vision. Because I believed I could manage the downside if it came. And because somewhere inside me, I still believed my brother wouldn't let it go too far. Normalizing disrespect doesn't feel like surrender. It feels like a compromise. Each small concession seems rational in isolation. Each reframing sounds harmless. Until one day you look up and realize the narrative has changed and you didn't write it. I was still co-owner, but I was no longer central. And the most dangerous shift wasn't what Daniel was doing. It was what I was allowing. Tell me, have you ever convinced yourself that staying quiet was wisdom when it was actually erosion? There's a moment when you realize you've been cast. Not promoted, not consulted, cast. It happened during a quarterly leadership retreat. One of those carefully curated weekends meant to signal unity. We were in a rented conference space overlooking the harbour, clean glass walls, catered lunch, slide decks projecting confidence. Daniel opened the session with a presentation titled Vision 2025, Growth Metrics, Geographic Expansion, Strategic Partnerships, Market Dominance. When he finished, he turned toward me with an easy smile. And of course, Emilia will make sure we stay protected while we scale, he said. She's our guardrails. The room nodded. A few executives even smiled at me gratefully. Guardrails. I felt it settle over to me, not as praise, but as limitation. Guardrails don't choose direction. They don't drive. They simply prevent the car from going too far off the road. The framing was subtle but complete. Daniel was the architect of movement. I was the manager of consequences. During breakout discussions, department heads approached him for strategy alignment. They approached me for risk mitigation. Emilia, can you review the vendor liability exposure? Emilia, what's our worst-case scenario if the Midwest rollout underperforms? No one asked me whether the Midwest rollout itself was structurally sound. That decision had already been made by the visionary. I didn't resent being competent. I didn't resent being trusted with complexity. What unsettled me was the narrowing. I was no longer a partner in shaping direction. I was the safety net beneath it. Later that evening, I stood by the harbour alone, watching boats move in slow, deliberate paths. Daniel joined me with 2 glasses of wine. You were quiet today, he observed. I was listening, I replied. He studied me for a moment. You know this works because of both of us. Does it? I thought. Out loud, I asked, if I disagreed with the next expansion phase publicly, would you pause? He hesitated. Pause, he repeated. We can't afford paralysis. That's not what I asked. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said something that sounded supportive. You're indispensable, Emilia. I couldn't do this without you. Indispensable. That word again. I understood something then, not intellectually, but structurally. As long as I remained indispensable operationally, I could be excluded strategically, because indispensable people are rarely replaced outright. They're simply boxed into utility, reliable, useful, predictable, invisible where it counts. In the months that followed, the role solidified. Daniel became the public face of innovation. I became the internal assurance that nothing catastrophic would happen. Board communications began referring to him as CEO in tone, if not officially in title. My input was requested on compliance updates, not directional pivots. And slowly, without confrontation, I saw the future forming. If expansion succeeded, Daniel would be credited. If expansion strained the company, I would be responsible for stabilizing it. I had been assigned the role of absorber, the person who prevents impact but receives it. What I didn't yet understand was that roles only hold power if you accept them fully. And somewhere beneath my composure, something was beginning to shift. Not anger, not rebellion, awareness. Tell me, when you realize you've been quietly boxed into a role you didn't choose, do you resist immediately, or do you first study the walls? The shift didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened on a Tuesday morning in silence. I was alone in my office reviewing the latest quarterly report. Revenue had grown, impressively, on paper. But the margins were tightening in ways that only someone trained to read covenants would notice. Our debt-to-EBITDA ratio was creeping toward a threshold embedded deep in the financing agreement. A threshold that, if crossed, would trigger enhanced lender oversight. It wasn't a crisis, not yet, but it was fragile. I pulled out the original shareholder agreement, the one our father signed when he transferred ownership. My copy was marked with handwritten notes in the margins from years ago, clauses I had insisted on at the time, protections Daniel had waved off as unnecessary. I flipped to a section I hadn't revisited in a long while. Voting rights adjustments under capital restructuring. There it was, quiet, clear, legal. If certain debt instruments altered control dynamics, protective provisions were activated. Provisions that required unanimous consent for additional leverage beyond a specified cap. Daniel had structured the recent financing in a way that approached that cap, but hadn't crossed it. Yet, I sat back in my chair. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was being sidelined. I started asking something else. What if this trajectory continues? Not emotionally, not personally, structurally. I began mapping the company the way I would analyze a client's risk profile. Cash flow volatility, expansion burn rate, personal guarantees. Daniel had signed to reassure lenders, performance triggers that relied on optimistic forecasts. I removed myself from the narrative of sister and brother. I studied it as a system, and the system had stress points. That realization didn't make me triumphant. It made me still. Because I understood something uncomfortable. I had been operating defensively for years, reacting, mitigating, absorbing, but I had never considered positioning. That morning, I did something subtle but irreversible. I stopped trying to correct Daniel. I stopped drafting long memos outlining projected downside scenarios. I stopped volunteering caution in rooms where caution was framed as obstruction. Instead, I began documenting. Not secretly, not maliciously, methodically. Every board vote, every adjusted projection, every covenant amendment, every personal guarantee Daniel signed. I requested copies of executed agreements under the pretense of compliance archiving, which was, technically, accurate. No one questioned it. Why would they? Emilia handles documentation. I also began consulting external governance experts, not about our company specifically, but about capital structures under growth strain. I attended seminars, quietly. I listened to case studies of companies that over-leveraged in pursuit of scale. Patterns emerged. Expansion fueled by debt can look brilliant, until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, control shifts quickly. That Tuesday morning, I realized something that changed me. Silence is not the absence of action. Silence can be preparation. I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't accuse him of recklessness. I didn't warn the board again. I simply adjusted my posture, from absorber to observer, from reactive to ready. And there was a calm that came with that shift. Not bitterness, not fear, clarity. Because for the first time, I wasn't asking how to protect the company from Daniel's ambition. I was asking how to protect myself from its consequences. Tell me, have you ever reached a point where arguing felt pointless and understanding felt powerful? After that Tuesday, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reluctant, defensive, a negotiation between self-respect and harmony. Now it was deliberate. Daniel interpreted it as acceptance. "You seem more relaxed lately," he said one afternoon, glancing at me across the conference table. "I think you're finally seeing the upside." I gave a small, neutral smile. "I'm seeing the structure more clearly." He took that as agreement. The expansion into the Midwest accelerated. New leases were signed. Inventory levels increased to meet projected demand. Marketing budgets expanded beyond what we had historically allocated. Investors praised the momentum. Lenders praised the growth narrative. Internally, I praised nothing. I simply monitored. Debt covenants tightened. Performance targets became more aggressive. Daniel personally guaranteed a secondary line of credit to reassure a hesitant bank. That decision caught my attention. Personal guarantees are not symbolic. They are pressure points. In meetings, when projections were presented with confident upward arcs, I no longer dissected them publicly. I asked neutral, clarifying questions. Can you walk me through the cash flow assumption in Q3? What contingency is built into supplier pricing volatility? I kept my tone calm, analytical, non-confrontational, but I stopped trying to persuade. Others interpreted my restraint as growth. Our CFO once told me privately, "It's good you and Daniel are more aligned now." Aligned! The word almost made me laugh. We weren't aligned, we were diverging quietly. What changed most was internal. I began separating identity from role. For years, I had tied my worth to preserving the company's stability, to be the one who prevented damage. Now, I examined a harder truth. Stability that depends on one person constantly absorbing risk is not stability. It's a dependency, and dependency is leverage. If the expansion succeeded, Daniel's stature would solidify beyond question. My role would shrink further into operational containment. If the expansion strained liquidity or breached covenants, lenders would step in. Control would shift. And every personal guarantee he signed would narrow his options. In both scenarios, my previous strategy, arguing, would change nothing. So I stopped arguing. Instead, I updated my personal finances. I diversified investments away from company equity exposure. I quietly consulted an attorney, not to initiate action, but to understand my protective rights under various stress scenarios. Again, nothing dramatic. Preparation is rarely dramatic. It looks like routine paperwork. It looks like calendar appointments labeled advisory consult. It looks like moving assets into structures that cannot be casually touched. Daniel mistook my composure for loyalty. The board mistook my restraint for unity. But what I had done was reclaim agency. Silence became a filter. I spoke when legally necessary. I withheld commentary when strategically irrelevant. And the more I withheld, the more Daniel stepped forward unchecked. Not because I enabled him, but because he no longer felt resistance. Ambition expands to fill the space it's given. And I gave him space, not out of submission, out of calculation. There's a difference between stopping a train and stepping off the tracks. I stepped off. I watched quarterly ratios inch closer to covenant thresholds. I watched expansion costs outpace stabilized revenue. I watched investor optimism harden into expectation. And I waited. Not for collapse, for inevitability. Because once structural pressure builds, it doesn't require sabotage. It only requires time. Tell me, have you ever realized that the most powerful move isn't to block someone's path, but to let them walk it uninterrupted? If you had looked at me from the outside during that year, you would have seen composure. I still attended every board meeting. I still reviewed every contract. I still responded to lender emails within the hour. Nothing in my behavior suggested withdrawal. What they never noticed was the expansion of a different kind. While Daniel expanded geographically, I expanded structurally. The first thing I did was reconstruct our entire capital stack independently, not relying on summaries, not relying on what was presented in meetings. I mapped every loan, every covenant trigger, every clause that could accelerate repayment under performance deviation. I color-coded risk thresholds. Green is healthy, amber is sensitive, red for activation risk. By Q2, more sections were amber than green. Not catastrophic, but tightening. I began tracking board language as carefully as financial ratios. Words matter in governance. Phrases like temporary variance and anticipated stabilization repeated themselves in meeting minutes. Repetition signals narrative management. I archived everything, not secretly, not illegally. These were documents I had full access to as co-owner and compliance director. But I organized them differently. Timeline-based, decision-linked, responsibility-tagged. If someone ever asked, "How did we get here?" I would be able to answer precisely. At the same time, I built relationships that Daniel never prioritized. I had quiet lunches with our senior operations managers, not to undermine him, simply to understand on-the-ground realities. Shipping delays, supplier strain, overtime fatigue. I listened more than I spoke. Patterns surfaced. Midwest demand was strong, but inconsistent. Inventory forecasting models were overly optimistic. Vendor payment cycles were stretching slightly longer each quarter. None of it is alarming in isolation, but collectively pressure. I also met, discreetly, with one of the minority investors during an industry conference. Not to contradict Daniel, just to introduce myself fully. It was remarkable how surprised he seemed. "I've heard a lot about Daniel's vision," he said politely. "I handle structural oversight," I replied evenly. "If you ever want deeper insight into risk management, I'm available." His eyes sharpened slightly. Investors appreciate confidence, but they trust clarity. That conversation planted something subtle, awareness that there was another axis of leadership within the company. Back home, I began preparing personally. I refinanced my home independently of company-linked collateral. I shifted a portion of my equity compensation into diversified holdings while the valuation was high. No dramatic exits, no public signals, just insulation. The most important preparation, though, wasn't financial. It was psychological. I asked myself difficult questions. If the company breaches covenants, will I intervene? If lenders demand restructuring, will I fight to protect Daniel's position? If personal guarantees trigger consequences, will I step in? For months, my answer was uncertainty. I am not naturally detached. Daniel is my brother. We built this company together under our father's roof. I know his strengths as intimately as his blind spots. But I also remembered something he once said during a tense call with investors. When revenue dipped briefly, "We can absorb short-term discomfort," he had told them confidently. "It's part of scaling. Short-term discomfort." When the private equity deal diluted certain protective rights and my objections were minimized, I experienced discomfort. He called it scaling, so I began reframing. If structural strain eventually circled back to him, if debt tightened around decisions he personally championed, was that cruelty or consequence? What they never noticed was this. I was no longer trying to prevent the future. I was preparing to choose my position within it. There is immense power in preparation that doesn't announce itself. No dramatic moves, no hostile takeovers, no whispered alliances. Just information, clarity, timing, and patience. By the end of that year, the numbers told a quiet story. Growth was real, but so was fragility. And fragility under leverage has a predictable arc. I didn't know exactly when pressure would peak, but I knew it would. And when it did, I would not be scrambling. I would be ready. "Tell me," Have you ever realized that the person who appears least reactive might be the one preparing most thoroughly? The private reveal didn't arrive with a headline. It arrived in a spreadsheet. Late one evening, after most of the office lights had dimmed, I was reviewing the updated quarterly lender compliance certificate. It was routine, something I had reviewed dozens of times before. Except this time, one line item made me pause. Adjusted EBITDA had been recalculated to include a projected cost synergy from a Midwest supplier consolidation that hadn't yet been executed. Projected, not realized. The adjustment wasn't illegal. It was technically permitted under certain forward-looking allowances in the loan agreement, but it narrowed the margin of safety to almost nothing. I pulled up the covenant schedule and recalculated manually, removing the projected adjustment. Without it, we were within 1.8% of triggering enhanced lender monitoring. 1.8%. Not collapse, not default, but exposure. And exposure under layered debt doesn't stay static. It compounds. I sat very still. This was the moment I had anticipated, not because the company was failing, but because it was vulnerable. If Q3 underperformed even modestly, lenders could demand revised projections. Revised projections would force transparency. Transparency would expose the fragility behind the growth narrative. And if that happened, control mechanisms would activate. I opened the shareholder agreement again. Under Section 4.3, protective provisions, any restructuring that materially altered equity distribution required the unanimous consent of the original majority holders. Me. Daniel had maneuvered influence. He had shaped perception. He had become the face of momentum. But structurally, he still needed my signature for any equity restructuring triggered by covenant breach. For years, I had focused on preventing that breach. Now I understand something different. If it occurred, my position strengthened, not weakened. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear, because leverage isn't loud, it's quiet. It doesn't need to threaten, it simply exists. The following week, Daniel announced in a leadership meeting that Q3 projections might need temporary recalibration. The language was careful, optimistic. But I saw the shift in his posture, slight tension in his jaw, faster pacing. After the meeting, he closed my office door. Some of the Midwest accounts are slower than forecast, he admitted. Nothing dramatic, just timing. Timing. How close are we to the covenant threshold without projected adjustments? I asked evenly. He hesitated, a fraction of a second too long. We're managing it. That wasn't an answer. I'd like full visibility, I said calmly. No adjustments. Raw numbers. His eyes flickered. Not anger. Something else. Awareness. He realized I wasn't asking as compliance director. I was asking as a co-owner. That evening, I received the full breakdown. Without optimistic add-backs, we were 0.9% from triggering enhanced oversight. Less than 1%. And here was the critical piece. Daniel had personally guaranteed the secondary credit facility tied to that performance band. If oversight triggered and restructuring was required, lenders could demand either additional capital injection or equity dilution. Equity dilution that required my consent. The circle had closed. Years ago, he structured a deal that sidelined my strategic influence while preserving my operational necessity. Now the structure required my agreement to preserve his control. I closed my laptop slowly. This was the private reveal. Not that he would fail, not that the company would collapse, but the balance of power had quietly equalized, and possibly tilted. I had three options. Intervene early, help renegotiate proactively and protect him. Remain neutral, let structural processes unfold narrowly. Or leverage the moment to renegotiate ownership terms permanently. None of those options required drama. None required revenge. Only decision. For the first time since the private equity deal, I felt something unfamiliar. Not defensive, not sidelined, not indispensable. Equal. Because leverage is the great equalizer in business. And Daniel had built a structure that now required mine. I didn't celebrate, I didn't confront him. I simply understood. The question was no longer whether I could act. It was whether I would. Tell me, when the power dynamic finally shifts in your favor, do you rush to use it, or do you sit with it first? When leverage appears, it feels almost unreal. For years I had adjusted to Daniel's pace, his framing, his vision. I had absorbed the impact quietly, believing that maintaining stability was loyalty. Now the structure he built required my agreement to sustain it. The numbers confirmed what instinct had already whispered. Q3 underperformed. Covenant monitoring would trigger within weeks unless lenders granted temporary flexibility. And lenders rarely grant flexibility without extracting something in return. Daniel requested a private meeting. No assistants, no CFO, just the two of us in the same conference room where he once described me as guardrails. He didn't waste time. We may need to restructure portions of the debt, he said, measured. It's procedural, nothing catastrophic. Procedural restructuring requires equity adjustment under Section 4.3, I replied calmly. His jaw tightened slightly. Yes, I know. There it was, the acknowledgement. For the first time in years, he wasn't positioning himself ahead of me. He was standing beside me. I'll need your support, he said carefully. Support. The word carried history. Years ago, I had needed his support when the private equity terms diluted the protective influence, when expansion projections stretched beyond conservative modelling. When I asked to slow down, he called it scaling. Now scaling had consequences. I went home that night and sat alone at my kitchen table with 3 documents in front of me. The updated covenant forecast, the shareholder agreement, a blank legal pad. I wrote 3 columns. Option 1, rescue. Help him renegotiate aggressively, inject personal capital if necessary, preserve his leadership position, maintain status quo narrative. Option 2, neutrality. Do nothing beyond legally required cooperation. Allow lenders to impose conditions organically. Let structural pressure dictate outcomes. Option 3, renegotiate permanently. Agree to restructuring, but only in exchange for governance recalibration. Formal co-CEO authority, revised voting protections, clear strategic veto rights. None of these options was cruel. None were illegal. All were within my rights. The question wasn't what I could justify legally. It was what I could live with personally. Daniel is not a villain in my story. He is ambitious, confident, prone to believing momentum will outrun gravity. But ambition without constraint had nearly erased me once. If I rescued him unconditionally, the narrative would reset. He would recover. Investors would praise resilience, and I would remain the invisible stabilizer. If I chose neutrality, lenders might dilute both of us. External control could enter more deeply. The company our father built would change irreversibly. If I renegotiated, I would be accused, quietly, perhaps internally, of taking advantage of vulnerability. That last possibility lingered. Was it an advantage or correction? For years, I had absorbed short-term discomfort in the name of growth. That was Daniel's philosophy. Now growth had produced discomfort for him. Was it betrayal to allow him to experience what he once minimized? I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. Rescue would protect him. Neutrality would protect me passively. Renegotiation would protect the future. I closed the legal pad and understood something essential. Doing nothing is still a choice. Doing everything is still a choice. But choosing alignment with your own dignity, that's irreversible. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with Daniel. Not to confront, to decide. Tell me, when faced with the chance to restore balance, do you aim to preserve peace or to redefine it? I didn't begin with demands. I began with data. When Daniel walked into my office that morning, he looked more tired than I had ever seen him. Not defeated, just pressed. Expansion requires energy, debt requires discipline, and pressure compresses both. I've spoken to the lenders, he said. They're open to restructuring the covenant bands, but they'll want revised projections and possibly equity warrants. Warrants that dilute existing control, I replied evenly. He nodded. We need to present a united front. There was the phrase again, united. I agree, I said calmly, but unity requires clarity. I placed a revised governance proposal in front of him. Not dramatic, not aggressive, structured. If restructuring triggered equity adjustments, we would formalize dual executive authority. Strategic initiatives above a defined capital threshold would require joint approval. Board communications would reflect co-leadership explicitly, not implied. No removal, no humiliation, no public correction. Just structural balance. Daniel read it silently. This is about power, he said after a long pause. It's about protection, I replied. For you, for the company. That wasn't a deflection, it was true. Unchecked leverage had created fragility. Governance symmetry would prevent repetition. He leaned back in his chair, studying me in a way he hadn't in years. You've been preparing for this, he said quietly. Yes, there was no accusation in his voice, only recognition. For the first time, I saw something in him that wasn't dominance or impatience. Respect. Not because I had cornered him, because I had positioned myself without noise. We didn't argue. We revised the language together, adjusted thresholds, clarified authority boundaries. It was businesslike, measured. When we presented the restructuring proposal to lenders, it was cohesive, professional, calm. The lenders appreciated the clarity. Governance stability reassures capital. Internally, nothing looked dramatic. No emergency memos, no public acknowledgement of strain. The company announced strategic recalibration aligned with long-term growth. The narrative remained intact, but beneath it, control had shifted. Equity warrants were issued, but under terms that preserved proportional influence. Governance language was amended to reflect co-executive authority explicitly. Capital allocation required dual sign-off. I didn't celebrate. There was no applause for a quiet correction. And I didn't tell anyone outside the legal room what had happened, because the most decisive moves rarely need witnesses. Daniel's posture changed subtly in the months that followed. He consulted earlier, shared projections before presenting them externally, invited my input before committing to lenders. Not out of fear, out of understanding. Pressure had revealed something he hadn't seen before. I was not the guardrail. I was half the engine, and I had chosen not to let the company collapse. But I had also chosen not to remain invisible. There's a difference between rescuing someone and resetting the terms of partnership. I didn't let him drown. But I didn't pull him ashore without condition. And no one outside the executive suite understood how close the structure had come to fracturing. That was intentional, because dominance doesn't require spectacle. It requires timing. Tell me, when you finally assert yourself, do you need the world to see it, or is knowing enough? The restructuring announcement was carefully worded. Strategic recalibration, enhanced governance alignment, disciplined growth phase. Externally, it sounded proactive, controlled, even wise. Internally, something subtle shifted. Daniel was still respected, still charismatic in presentations, still the architect of expansion. But the room felt different. When major capital expenditures were proposed, eyes moved between us now, not automatically toward him. When lenders joined quarterly calls, they addressed questions to both of us by name. Emilia, how are you assessing covenant headroom this quarter? Daniel, what operational efficiencies are you prioritizing? Balance, not symbolic, structural. For Daniel, the adjustment wasn't loud, but it was real. He had built a narrative of singular leadership. Now that the narrative requires amendment. Not because he failed publicly, but because pressure exposed the necessity of shared authority. There were consequences he hadn't anticipated. Investors began requesting joint strategy memos. Board members who once aligned primarily with him started looping me into early-stage discussions. Nothing hostile, just recalibrated. And recalibration changes identity. One afternoon, after a board session that ran longer than expected, Daniel lingered behind. They're looking to you more now, he said quietly. They're looking at governance, I replied. He exhaled slowly. I didn't think it would get that close. I know! There was no triumph in my voice, only fact. For years, he had framed my caution as constraint. Now that caution had become the reason lenders extended flexibility at all. Consequences don't always look like collapse. Sometimes they look like redistribution. His personal guarantees were renegotiated but not erased. They remained as reminders, financial gravity tethered to ambition. Operationally, we scaled back aggressively. Slower hiring, tighter inventory management, vendor renegotiations. Daniel adapted, but he was no longer unchecked. And that shift required humility. I watched him recalibrate in real time. He asked more questions in internal reviews. He paused before committing to new markets. He invited my analysis without defensiveness. It would be easy to call this a victory. It wasn't. It was in equilibrium. There's a quiet discomfort when someone who once overshadowed you begins to see you clearly. Not as support, not as background, but as an equal force. That discomfort is a consequence, not punishment. Consequence is simply the weight of reality aligning with structure. For me, the greatest consequence was internal. I no longer felt reactive. I no longer waited to be included. I no longer questioned whether my restraint had been weakness. It hadn't. It had been timing. Daniel wasn't crushed, but he was constrained. And constraint is often more transformative than collapse, because collapse allows for excuses. Constraint requires adjustment. Tell me, have you ever watched someone finally confront the limits they once dismissed and felt neither joy nor bitterness, only balance? Stability returns slowly, but not completely. Debt doesn't disappear because it's renegotiated. It lingers. Covenants tighten. Oversight increases. Freedom narrows. 6 months after restructuring, the broader market shifted. Supplier costs rose unexpectedly. One of our largest Midwest clients delayed a contract renewal. Nothing dramatic on its own, but under leverage, small tremors feel larger. Our margins compressed again. This time, lenders didn't threaten immediately. They requested deeper reporting, weekly liquidity updates instead of monthly. Detailed forward cash projections were reviewed line by line. Daniel felt it first. His pace changed. His calls ran longer. His confidence, though still present, had acquired a new edge, one shaped by caution rather than momentum. One evening, he came into my office after everyone had left. "We should have slowed earlier," he said quietly. It wasn't an apology, it was recognition. "We can't undo the capital structure overnight," I replied. He nodded. "There are moments when reality settles with weight, not explosive, not theatrical, just heavy." We ran scenarios together. Asset divestment options, operational consolidation, strategic sale of a minority regional branch to free liquidity. Each option required trade-offs. Each option reduced the version of the company Daniel once envisioned. That's the part people misunderstand when they hear this story. He wasn't facing ruin in flames, he was facing contraction. Ambition compressing under its own leverage. And once you've signed guarantees, issued warrants, amended governance, there is no clean rewind. Too late doesn't always mean disaster. Sometimes it means the original vision cannot be restored. There was a week when Daniel suggested something unexpected. "If we sold a controlling stake to stabilize permanently, would you consider stepping back with me?" Stepping back. Equal retreat. I studied him carefully. Years ago, when dilution shifted influence away from me, I asked him to pause. He didn't. Now he was proposing shared surrender. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I asked, "Is that the best outcome for the company, or the least painful for you?" The question lingered between us. He looked away first. It wasn't about ego anymore. It was about preservation. And here is where many expect revenge. A sharp refusal, a cold dismissal, a quiet, "You did this to yourself." But that wasn't what happened. What happened was more restrained and more final. "We'll evaluate every option," I said calmly. "But I won't abandon governance discipline to relieve short-term pressure." His shoulders lowered slightly. Not defeated, just accepting. Too late to fix it doesn't mean too late to learn. The expansion fantasy was gone. In its place was disciplined consolidation, slower growth, tighter oversight. Shared authority is embedded in every major decision. The version of Palmer industrial supply that Daniel once imagined, fast, national, aggressive, would not materialize. That door had closed, not because I slammed it, because debt did, and I chose not to override the lesson. Tell me, when someone finally recognizes their mistake, is forgiveness about erasing consequence or letting consequence reshape them? The confrontation, if you can call it that, happened on a grey Thursday afternoon. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just honesty that had taken years to surface. We were in the smaller conference room this time, not the one with the skyline view. The atmosphere felt appropriately scaled down. Daniel closed the folder in front of him and looked at me directly. "I underestimated you," he said. Not dramatically, not theatrically, simply stated. I held his gaze. "You underestimated structure," I replied. A faint exhale escaped him, almost a half smile. That too. There was no need to recount every decision. No need to relitigate the private equity deal, the diluted protections, the meetings I wasn't invited at. We both remembered. "I thought momentum would compensate for risk," he continued. "I thought if we moved fast enough, the numbers would follow." "They often do," I said calmly, "until they don't." Silence settled between us, not hostile, just reflective. He tapped the edge of the table lightly. "When you stopped pushing back so hard, I assumed you agreed." "I stopped arguing," I corrected. "I didn't stop thinking." That landed. For years, my silence had been interpreted as a concession. Now he understood it had been an assessment. "I should have brought you in sooner," he admitted. "You should have listened sooner," I replied. Not sharp, not accusatory, just true. There was no apology in the traditional sense, no dramatic, "I'm sorry for everything." But accountability doesn't always arrive wrapped in emotion. Sometimes it arrives as altered behavior. He looked at the updated governance framework on the table, the dual approvals, the rebalanced authority. "You were right to insist on this," he said quietly. I didn't respond immediately. Because what I felt wasn't vindication. It was closure. Not the kind where wounds disappear. The kind where misalignment no longer defines you. I didn't insist on winning, I said. I insisted on preventing repetition. He nodded slowly. I know! And in that moment, something shifted that had nothing to do with contracts or covenants. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to outpace me. He was meeting me. Confrontation without heat is different from conflict. It doesn't seek dominance. It clarifies reality. There were things we would never say aloud. That he once believed my caution limited him. That I once believed his ambition would ruin us. That we both were partially right. Before he left the room, he paused. You didn't let me fall, he said. No, I answered. You could have. Yes. Another quiet pause. Why didn't you? He asked. I considered the answer carefully. Because I didn't need you to lose, I said. I needed the structure to change. That was the truth. Not revenge. Correction. And correction, when done calmly, reshapes relationships without destroying them. Tell me, have you ever realized that the most powerful confrontation is the one that doesn't require anger at all? People sometimes assume that after something like this, you reinvent yourself dramatically. You leave, you sever ties, you become colder, sharper, untouchable. That didn't happen. I'm still quiet. I still review contracts line by line. I still ask the questions that make rooms pause. I still prefer clarity over applause. But I am no longer positioned. There's a difference. Before, I defined myself by usefulness, by how much strain I could absorb without complaint, by how well I could stabilize someone else's ambition. Now I define myself by authorship. If I sign something, it reflects my judgment. If I approve something, it aligns with my standards. If I remain silent, it is deliberate. The company today is leaner, more disciplined, slower in expansion, but stronger in structure. Governance is explicit. Authority is shared, not implied. What? Daniel and I still work together, but we work differently. He brings ideas to me earlier now, not because he fears opposition, but because he values calibration. And I no longer soften my analysis to preserve comfort. Our conversations are shorter, cleaner, more honest. There is respect where there used to be assumptions. And as for me, I no longer need to prove that caution is strength. I know it is. The emotional shift is quieter than most would expect. I don't feel triumphant. I don't feel wounded. I feel settled. There was a time when being underestimated felt like erasure. Now I understand it as a miscalculation. Someone else's, not mine. The greatest change is internal. I no longer equate loyalty with self-sacrifice. I no longer confuse indispensability with security. And I no longer believe that staying invisible protects peace. Peace isn't maintained by shrinking. It's maintained by alignment. I also learned something else, something I didn't anticipate. Restraint is more powerful than retaliation. I could have let the structure collapse. I could have withheld consent and allowed lenders to tighten until Daniel was cornered. But that would have proven nothing. True dominance is not about watching someone fall. It's about ensuring you are never placed beneath them again. The black leather portfolio still sits on my desk. The original shareholder agreement still carries my margin notes. But now, when I flip through those pages, I don't see protection. I see authorship. I am not the guardrail. I am not the absorber. I am not the quiet backup plan. I am a co-architect. And perhaps that's what this entire journey was really about. Not debt, not expansion, not even my brother. Identity. Tell me, when you look at who you've become after surviving quiet betrayal, do you see loss or do you see evolution? There's something people misunderstand about power. They think it announces itself. They think it's loud, decisive, unmistakable. But real power often moves quietly. It waits. It observes. It documents. It prepares. When my brother once maneuvered me out of influence, he believed speed was strength. That momentum could outrun risk. That if he moved boldly enough, structure would adjust around him. Years later, when that same structure tightened, I stood in a position where I could have let it crush him. And I didn't. Not because I was weak, not because I forgot, but because I had already reclaimed what mattered most, my agency. I didn't need him to fail to feel whole again. I needed the imbalance corrected. That's the difference between revenge and resolution. Revenge seeks pain. Resolution seeks alignment. I didn't stand by and watch him collapse out of cruelty. I stood still, Because sometimes the most honest teacher in business and in life is consequence. If you rescue someone from every outcome of their own decisions, you don't love them. You delay their growth. And if you silence yourself to preserve harmony, you don't protect peace. You abandon authorship. What happened between my brother and me wasn't cinematic. It wasn't explosive. It was structural. Quiet dominance is not about overpowering someone. It's about understanding the system well enough that you never again surrender your place within it. So if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever watched someone take the lead while minimizing your caution, if you've ever been told you were essential but not central, remember this: stillness can be a strategy, documentation can be leveraged, silence can be a choice. And when the balance shifts, you don't need to shout. You only need to decide. Now I'm curious, if you were in my position, would you have stepped in sooner to save him? Or would you have let consequence reshape the structure first?